Welcome to BIA, Canada's top black media provider. Whether you're looking for shows on fashion, art, music, or simple lifestyle, we bring you the best content the black community in Canada has to offer and so much more. And better yet, do you have an idea for a project you'd like us to help you with? We provide equipment, studio, and office space, as well as a team of dedicated individuals to help you bring those ideas to life. So don't wait. Check out our new website at biamedia.ca for more information on how to contact us and start creating today. BIA Media, your way.
More information. All right, so our discussion for this week are the movement that we're going to be talking about, because you remember we're always talking about movements and meetings. The movement that we're going to be talking about is the movement for Pan-Africanism. Up until this point, we've been talking about Pan-Africanism as a movement and the idea of African people coming together from around the world, discussing their problems. And in the first half of the 20th century, Pan-Africanism was a movement. And for some people, it's still a movement. However, by the time we get to the mid-1960s, particularly influenced by Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Pan-Africanism moves from a movement to an objective. So this is the movement to achieve the objective of Pan-Africanism. And we'll talk about what Pan-Africanism is as an objective in a second. And the main meeting that we're going to be discussing is the OAU, the Organization of African Unity's meeting, Assembly of Heads of States and Government from July 17th to July 21st, 1964. It's a very influential meeting that took place in Cairo, Egypt in 1964. So the crux of our discussion will be, in what ways did Ghana operate as a liberated zone in the first half of the 1960s? And we'll define what a liberated zone is. And we'll also discuss how the OAU was formed and what were the debates surrounding its formation. It's a debate about the objective of Pan-Africanism. So we're going to talk about that as well, and some key figures that operated during this time, again, that made these Pan-African connections. So all right, so first key term for the day, and you can share it. Liberated zone. This is our fifth key term. We're in week 5, and it's, I'll read it to you because for some reason the bottom of it won't show. But what a liberated zone is, a liberated zone has two aspects to it, and this is all laid out by Kwame Nkrumah in his book, The Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, that came out in 1968. But he defined a liberated zone in two ways. One, it's a territory in which independence was secured through an armed struggle. We talked about armed struggle last week, or through a positive action movement representing the majority of the population under the leadership of an anti-imperialist and well-organized mass party. So let me break down this definition. So if a country or a territory got their independence through an armed struggle, the way we talked about Algeria fighting the French last week and how violent that struggle was, and Algeria got its independence in 1962 going that route, that is one of the markers of a liberated zone. Or if it was a country like Ghana, which used positive action, which was a non-violent resistance movement, that could be considered a liberated zone. But the key is under the leadership of an anti-imperialist and well-organized mass party. That's the key. The political party in charge has to be based in the masses of the working people of the country in order for it to be considered a liberated zone. And it has to be anti-imperialist. So you can't say that you're for your people, but you're working side by side with the British or the French or the Americans who are, using new forms of imperialism to subjugate other people. You can't say that you're liberated if you're like that. So if you got independence that way, you could be considered a liberated zone. The second way a territory could become a liberated zone is if a puppet regime was overthrown by a people's movement. This happened in Zanzibar at the time, Congo, Brazzaville, and in Egypt. So if a country didn't get independence the first way, let's say independence was just given, let's say by the French. In the case of Congo, Brazzaville, independence was given by the French, but eventually because the party that took over at independence was in bed with the imperialists, and didn't represent the masses of the people, the masses rose up and overthrew that party. Same thing happened in Egypt when you had a military coup to overthrow a leader that was in bed with the British. So if your country got independence under a puppet, but then the people overthrew the puppet, it could be considered a liberated zone. Or, and the last way, a social revolution is taking place to consolidate political independence by, number one, promoting accelerated economic development, number two, improving working conditions, and number three, establishing complete freedom. These are the ways that a country could be defined as a liberated zone. So the first characteristic is how the country got independence. The second aspect of a liberated zone is what a country does with that independence. What a country does with that independence. So how you get independence and then what you do with it. So the other aspect of a liberated zone, it has to be a territory that actively supports the detachment of revolutionary liberation movements in the contested zones of Africa. So if a country's independent, but it's not supporting the other forces that are fighting for independence, it's not really a liberated zone. It has to contribute to the organization and revolutionary practice of the people's forces in neo-colonialist states, i.e. zones under enemy control or in contested areas. So you're either helping other countries get independent, you're helping countries that are independent, the movements in those countries to overthrow puppets, and then three, you are creating effective you're effecting an organic liaison of the political and economic life with the other liberated zones on the African nation. So these are the three things that liberated zones have to do. You got to support forces that are fighting for independence. You have to support movements that are fighting against neo-colonial puppets. And then number three, you have to be active in bringing those forces together in order to create a more unified Africa. All of these are aspects of a liberated zone. You have to do all these things to truly be considered free in the eyes of Kwame Nkrumah and some of the revolutionary Pan-Africanists. So Nkrumah is laying all this out in 1968 based off the things that he saw in the early 1960s as more countries were getting independent. He was seeing more and more countries come under enemy control, or they were contested zones. So there's three types of zones you could have for Nkrumah: liberated, enemy held, or contested. Ghana was a liberated zone because it did all these things. It got independence through positive action. It was under the control of a mass-based political party, the Convention People's Party. And then, like we talked about last week, Nkrumah used Ghana's resources to actively support liberation movements, to actively support people's movements to overthrow puppets, and to bring those political parties together to talk about the future of Africa, the future of a united Africa. Okay, stop sharing. All right, so with Ghana in this state, as a liberated zone, from 1957 to 1966, we could say Ghana was a liberated zone, and we'll talk about what happens in 1966. One of the key figures that visited Ghana during its time as a liberated zone was Malcolm X. And this is incredibly significant because both Malcolm X and Kwame Nkrumah were, in effect, children of the Garvey movement. Children of the Garvey movement. We talked about the Garvey movement. We've been talking about it for the past couple of weeks and how influential it was. Malcolm's parents, Louise Langdon and Earl Little, met in the Garvey movement in Montreal, Canada. That's the only reason why Malcolm X's parents met was because of the Garvey movement. His father, Earl Little, was an organizer for the Garvey movement. His mother was an organizer for the Garvey movement and a writer for the Negro World. So Malcolm's father used to take him to the meetings that Marcus Garvey, as he organized chapters of the UNIA across the Midwest of the United States. So Earl Little went from Philadelphia to Montreal to Omaha, Nebraska to Michigan, all setting up chapters of the UNIA. And he would take Malcolm as a young child with him until he was assassinated, until Malcolm's father was killed. So Malcolm grew up in the early part of his life hearing about Marcus Garvey and Marcus Garvey's movement. And then, and if you want to know in depth about the life of Malcolm X, we did a seminar 2 years in a row on Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And the recordings of those lectures and the reading materials associated with that are on our course website. You just have to go and register for that class seminar on Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. So all that information is there. So I won't go into detail about his life, but if you know anything about Malcolm's life, it kind of goes off track after his father is killed. His mother is suffering from some mental health issues. His family gets separated. He ends up in foster care. He ends up dropping out of school in the 8th grade, getting into a life of crime, gets incarcerated, eventually joins with the Nation of Islam after a number of his brothers and sisters had already joined the Nation of Islam. He turns his life around in prison, becomes a minister in the Nation of Islam, and then takes off from there. The other interesting thing, the Nation of Islam itself is an offshoot of the Garvey movement. Many of the early members of the Nation of Islam, including Elijah Muhammad, were members of the Garvey movement. So we see the seeds of this movement everywhere. So even as Malcolm gets reintroduced into Black activism through the Nation of Islam, it still has a Garvey imprint on it. By the time we get to 1964, however, Malcolm is out of the Nation of Islam. He had left the Nation of Islam in 1963 for a number of factors, probably the most important being the nation's kind of reluctance to really get involved in the civil rights movement. That was a position taken by the leadership in the Nation of Islam to be a purely religious organization, and Malcolm wanted to get more involved in the civil rights movement. So that was, and then were other factors as well. We won't get into those. You can look at that other class to see the details. But by 1964, Malcolm is out of the Nation of Islam, and he begins traveling. He makes 2 trips abroad from the United States to both Europe and Africa in 1964. One in April of 1964, where he visits Ghana, Nigeria, Liberia, and I believe Tanzania, Egypt, because I think he goes to Tanzania in July. And when he's in Ghana, he meets with a number of people. He meets with Nkrumah. He talks to Nkrumah about Pan-Africanism. And going back to Nkrumah being a child of Garvey, Nkrumah already talks about it. He talked about the influence that Marcus Garvey had. And we talked about Nkrumah's early life in our last seminar on African student movements. Nkrumah, raised in the Gold Coast, comes to the United States, attends Lincoln University. While he's in the United States, he gets involved in activities of the UNIA, both in Philadelphia as well as in Harlem, New York. And he says no book influenced him more than the philosophies and opinions of Marcus Garvey. And Nkrumah also does some work with Garvey's first wife, Amy Ashwood Garvey, in the organizing of the 5th Pan-African Congress. So again, both Malcolm and Nkrumah are in effect children of the Garvey movement. And then they share this idea that Africans around the world need each other in order to advance. And this idea is Pan-Africanism as a movement. But Nkrumah was convincing Malcolm of the need for Pan-Africanism as an objective. So let me break down the difference. Pan-Africanism as a movement is the idea of African people and African descendant people around the world coming together, discussing their issues, and figuring out ways to support each other. Pan-Africanism as an objective is this, and Nkrumah laid this out. It's the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism. That's the objective. So it moves from a movement to something to be achieved. The total liberation, so a complete end to colonization, and unification. Nkrumah said Africa's future has to be united. There needs to be a United States of Africa, and we'll lay down his reasons for thinking that. And he's telling Malcolm in 1964 when they meet, this is the objective, because if Africa's united and strong and totally liberated, then we can more powerfully assert the rights of Afro-Americans who are struggling under segregation, racism, and all these things. And we can support the movements for independence in the Caribbean and the development of the Caribbean, or wherever African people find themselves, whether they're even in China or Japan or Russia, wherever their rights may be in jeopardy, a united Africa could support them. And Malcolm agreed with this idea. He agreed that Nkrumah's idea about Pan-Africanism was correct. So Malcolm and Nkrumah are talking in Ghana, but again, he's not the only African American in Ghana at this time. Maya Angelou, who you see here on the right, is in Ghana, because once Ghana got free in 1957, a number of African Americans decided that we're just going to move to Ghana. This is a liberated zone. Nkrumah invited us back to help develop the country, to come live. So a lot left, including Maya Angelou and others. This is the widow of W.E.B. Du Bois, who died in Ghana. He died the night before the March on Washington in 1963 at the age of 95. He had given up his American citizenship, or it was effectively stripped from him because he was a communist, and he goes to Ghana. And he continues to work all the way up until he dies at age 95 in 1963, because Nkrumah had invited him there. So this is Shirley Graham Du Bois, Du Bois's widow. So she's with Malcolm. So it was a number of African-American expatriates in Ghana at the time. So and Malcolm met with that community as well. So all of this is happening, and Malcolm is traveling throughout Africa and engaging in these ideas about Pan-Africanism. Ghana at the time, being a liberated zone, not only invited African Americans there, but also invited those liberation movements and independence movements throughout the continent to come and use Ghana as a place to meet, to strategize. Ghana was used to train troops from Zimbabwe and even South Africa that were about to begin their fight, their armed struggle against independence. Ghana was used as a training ground for them. So Nkrumah really used Ghana's resources for the entire African continent. That was his idea. And part of that was these All-African Peoples Conferences that we talked about last week, that Fanon attended, that Lumumba attended, representatives from the ANC, the African National Congress in South Africa attended. So Ghana was really creating a space to create this vision of a united Africa. This is what Nkrumah wanted. And then, of course, we see this famous picture that we looked at last week, that when Nkrumah and the other African leaders would travel to the US to go to the UN, they made it a point to rally in Harlem to let African Americans know that, hey, we are united in this struggle. So you see in this picture, you see Malcolm X, you see Nkrumah, you see Adam Clayton Powell, one of the few blacks in the House of Representatives in the US, representing Harlem, and others. And last week we talked about Carlos Cooks, who was one of the people that helped put this together. And Dr. King was on the American Committee on Africa's committee. He was one of the officers. So we're seeing all this connection. And Ghana is playing a major role as the territory in Africa that's doing the most to bring this vision alive. So yeah, we talked about this. And this picture was taken in October 1960. It was a very interesting and fateful time, October 1960 for Africa, because of what was unfolding right in the heart of Africa, in the Congo. And it's this Congo crisis that's going to happen that is really the test for Nkrumah, or really the instance for Nkrumah that shows the express need for African unification. The Congo crisis puts it in stark picture for everybody. And after this Congo crisis, which I'll talk about, Nkrumah writes this book, The Challenge of the Congo. And he says, if we allow the independence of Congo to be compromised in any way by the imperialists and neo-colonialists, the whole of Africa will be exposed to grave risk. This is how important the Congo is. Malcolm X, in his speeches to African Americans, always talked about the Congo, particularly after 1960, after this crisis that we're going to talk about, because it's that important. And even in 2022, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is probably the most strategically important country in Africa because of its resources, because of the fact that it borders 10 other African countries, its size. It's incredibly important strategically. And what happened in 1960 to the Democratic Republic of Congo is a tragedy and a crime that every African person should know about. And it's something that should be studied so we can figure out how stuff like this shouldn't happen again. But let me go run it down very quickly. We talked about the Congo in week 1. We talked about what the Belgians did in the Congo. A genocide essentially occurred in the Congo between the 1880s and the early 19th century, when King Leopold was in charge of the Congo. When the Belgian government actually takes over administration of the colony in the early 20th century, things don't get that much better. And the Belgians don't put much into the Congo. We talked about this. So one of the independence fighters and organizers for the Congo was Patrice Lumumba. So Lumumba was in the same vein of an Nkrumah or an Ahmed Sékou Touré or the other liberation activists in Africa. And he was the leader of the Congolese National Movement, the MNC. He attended the All African People's Conference in Ghana in 1958, representing the liberation struggle in the Congo. And in 1960, the Belgians realized that they couldn't hold on to the Congo anymore as a colony. And unlike the French or the British, that at least tried to have a transition period where there was self-government for some of their colonies before complete independence, the Belgians basically acted like children. They said, okay, we can't have the Congo, fine, here, just be independent. We'll rush, we'll have an election, and we'll let the Congolese essentially destroy themselves. Because number one, we put very little infrastructure into the Congo. Educational infrastructure, the only roads we built were just roads to get to the resources and to take the resources out of the country. Very little hospitals were built. It was just naked exploitation of the Congo pretty much by the Belgians. So they rushed and said, okay, you want independence? You guys are advocating for independence? Here's your independence. Have your elections, and this is what it'll be. What the Belgians didn't realize was how powerful and charismatic Patrice Lumumba was. So he actually gets elected prime minister, and the Belgians weren't ready for this because they thought one of his opponents, Chambe, was going to become the prime minister. But that didn't happen. So Lumumba becomes prime minister. He's elected prime minister in June 24th, 1960. I want you to pay very close attention to these dates. The important thing that happens, though, when he takes over an army that still has Belgian military officers in it that are still under control of the army. That's going to play a key role. Here's the timeline. 6 days later, independence is granted to the Congo. And most people think Lumumba kind of signed his death warrant at independence. There was a ceremony to hand over power to the Congolese. And in the ceremony, a representative from the Belgian government was in attendance. I'm not sure if it was somebody from the royal family or an elected official. But an official from the Belgians was at the ceremony, and he gets up and he talks about all the good things that the Belgians did to the Congo, the civilization that they brought to the Congo, and how grateful the Congolese people should be for everything that the Belgians had done since they had administered the colony. And then he sits down. And then Lumumba was not scheduled to speak. He gets up because he can't let this just, pass, that this Belgian guy's going to get up there and tell these lies about what all the Belgians did for the Congo. So he gets up and tells the truth. No, you raped the Congo. You exploited the Congo. You did this, that, and the third to the Congo. So the observers, the French, the Americans, the Canadians that are watching this are saying, this is a guy that we need to look out for because he's radical, he's revolutionary. So independence in June 30th, 1960. A month, not even a month later, about 2 weeks later, an area in eastern Congo, southeastern Congo, Katanga, secedes from the Congo. This is because the leadership in Katanga was upset that this is the area where Chambe was from, Lumumba's adversary, because he didn't get the prime ministership, and because he had ties to the Belgians, and Katanga was one of the wealthy areas of the Congo, where a lot of the mineral wealth was. He says, I'm breaking away. We're starting our own country. This is 2 weeks after independence, Katanga secedes. Lumumba wants to get that part of the country back into the Congo. This is a crisis 2 weeks after independence. And the Belgians are actively supporting Shambe. He goes to the UN for support. He says, hey, the day after, Lumumba says, I can't trust my army because the Belgians still control it. I need UN troops to help me bring this part of my country back into the country. Who steps in? Because the UN kind of drags their feet. Ghana steps in. Ghana says, we'll give you the military assistance. Again, Nkrumah acting like a liberated zone, using Ghana's resources to support someone else. Day after that, Congo breaks diplomatic relations with Belgium and signs an appeal to Russia because it couldn't get help from the UN, which was controlled by the US and the French, which are Belgian allies. So he goes to Russia for military assistance. He has no other recourse. He asks Russia for help. The US looks at this and says, oh, so that means you're with the Russians. That means you're a communist. That means you're an enemy to capitalists and democracy. So now you're an enemy to us. All of this is all because the Congo, again, is one of the richest places on earth. This is where the mineral wealth was. So the Belgians and the French and the Americans want a leader like Shambe in charge, not Lumumba, because now they'll have access to Congolese resources. So this is 2 weeks after independence, all this is happening. And Shambe says this. So this is where Katanga is on the map. Shambe says this. He says, the people of Katanga do not think they can support the decision taken by Mr. Lumumba to break off diplomatic relations with Belgium. And this is the key point, to which they are indebted for their economic, social development, their well-being and prosperity. Shambe is saying that the people of Katanga are indebted to the Belgians for their economic and social development. So we already see where his mind is. So where all this is going on in the background, I just want to highlight this for the Canadian folks. The Prime Minister of Canada at the time called Lumumba a major threat to Western interests, only because Lumumba wanted to use Congo's resources for the Congolese, not for the French, not for the Belgians, not for the Americans, but for the Congolese. But he had to deal with Shambe. So all this has happened 2 weeks after independence. August 1960, UN troops finally enter Katanga, but they only enter under Shambe's terms. So Shambe allows the UN troops to come in, but he's essentially in control. In September, President Casablanca was another player in this. So the Congo government had a prime minister as Lumumba who had the power, and the president was kind of ceremonial. Casablanca was another adversary of Lumumba. He announced that he was revoking Lumumba's appointment as prime minister. Even though the president was a ceremonial position and Lumumba had the power, the president technically could revoke the prime minister. And then Lumumba responded by revoking him. So you have this crisis of leadership at the top. And Casablanca is another one that's kind of somewhat in the pocket of the West. September 14th, 1960, the Army Chief of Staff Mobutu comes into play. And this is Mobutu here. That's Shambe, that's Mobutu. The Army Chief of Staff Mobutu announced that he was assuming power and neutralizing both Lumumba and Casablanca. So both the president and the prime minister are going to be removed from power by the Army Chief of Staff, Mobutu. Lumumba is placed under house arrest. In December 1960, he's arrested by Mobutu's men. And then January 1961, Lumumba is transported to that breakaway region of Katanga under Shambe. Because what Lumumba was trying to do after he was placed on house arrest by Mobutu, he was attempting to go back around the country, around the Congo, to rally support of the masses who still believed in Lumumba and were ready to coalesce and defend his position. But he was captured. He was taken to that breakaway region of Katanga, and there he was assassinated. His body was chopped up along with one of his compatriots, put in a vat of acid and dissolved. And this was all done and coordinated by the CIA, the Belgians, and with some assistance from the Canadians that were overseeing some of these UN troops that Lumumba had invited in to protect the country, that was supposed to uphold the country's sovereignty. And this is not whispered down the lane. This is not conspiracy theory, because the CIA actively talks about this. They said this man was such a threat that we're going to actively assist in his assassination. Not even a year. This is January 1961. He's elected prime minister in June 1960. So 6 months, essentially 6 months after he's elected prime minister, he's assassinated. And people wonder, when people ask that question, why hasn't Africa developed? What's wrong with African people that they can't get out of destroying themselves? This is why. 6 months after independence, we see the assassination of the elected prime minister with the assistance of Canada, the US, France, Belgium, and people like Shambe and Kasavubu and Mobutu, who ultimately takes over the Congo for many years, up until the 1990s, and just rapes the country completely dry, and with his kleptocracy or his government of theft. So this is what's going on. And Nkrumah sees this. Again, Nkrumah attempted to send Ghanaian troops to the to the Congo to help out with this, but it wasn't enough. And it was this crisis that Malcolm X watched. In all his speeches, he would call Shambe the worst African. He would call him the supreme Uncle Tom, like just would anytime he got to talk about Shambe and the Lumumba crisis, he would. For Nkrumah, this was evidence of the need for Pan-Africanism. Because if Africa was united, if Africa had one military, one currency, one political system, this wouldn't have happened. The Western powers wouldn't have been able to coordinate this and facilitate this assassination of Lumumba. And right before, in the 6 months that Lumumba was prime minister, an agreement had been reached with Ghana that they were going to create a United States of Africa. There were 4 countries involved in this. Ghana, under Kwame Nkrumah, Guinea under Sékou Touré, and we already talked last week about the relationship between Ghana and Guinea, when Guinea was the only French colony to say no to the French, that they weren't going to be a part of this neo-colonial scheme called the French African Community, and they said no, and the French, tried to destabilize Guinea the same way that the Belgians tried to destabilize the Congo. Ghana gave Guinea a loan to stabilize it, to make sure that its independence wasn't compromised. So Ghana and Guinea were united. They signed an agreement. And then Mali joined that agreement under Modibo Keita, the leader of Mali, Modibo Keita. So Ghana, Guinea, and Mali were going to form the nucleus of the United States of Africa. All those leaders agreed. And then Lumumba agreed to join. So there was the Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Congo Union. These were going to be the first 4 states in the United States of Africa. And one by one, the West saw this idea, because a United States of Africa is the one idea that the West cannot stomach. And when we talk later on in a few weeks about what happened with Libya in 2011, the same thing repeats itself. When leaders start talking about Africa uniting, having one military, one currency, one economic system, one foreign policy, it's a threat. So this just crystallized for Nkrumah the need for a United States of Africa and others. And he writes a book called Africa Must Unite. Not long, he was working on this book beforehand, but he really, after the Congo crisis, really expressed these ideas. And here's the reasons why he gave. He says, a united Africa should have an overall economic planning on a continental basis. The way our countries are set up, many of them are monocrop or dual crop economies or one resource economies. We need to have a continental economic system planning, so that one country is growing food while another country is growing this. We could have comparative advantage and everybody could grow rich. But we have to plan that on a continental scale. The establishment of a unified military and defense strategy. The militaries in Africa aren't outward facing militaries, meaning when the colonizers came in, they didn't create militaries that were ever going to be able to defeat the British, the French, the Americans, or anybody else trying to invade. They were really designed, they were inward-facing militaries to quell internal dissent. So Nkrumah says we got to change that. If we have a united military and defense strategy, overnight Africa would have one of the largest armies in the world, on par with China and Russia in terms of the men that they would have under arms. So we should have a united military strategy so that we can't have things like the Congo Crisis happen again. And he says, Africa should also have a united foreign policy and diplomacy to give political direction to their joint efforts of protection and economic development. So instead of having Ghana by itself negotiating with the United States and France and Britain, or Nigeria by itself, if we have a united foreign policy, we can get more done and have more things beneficial to Africa. Hey, we might even be able to get a united Africa, a seat on the UN Security Council, a permanent seat. If you know anything about the UN, the most powerful body in the UN is the Security Council. And there's only 5 permanent members on the Security Council: the United States, Russia, France, Britain, and China. That's it. Everybody else kind of rotates. They're not permanent members. It makes no sense that Africa doesn't have a seat on the Security Council. But that's because Africa's not united. So these were the main reasons that Nkrumah outlined why Africa should be united, and Africa must unite. A few countries agreed with Nkrumah. Not many, but a few did. And they were known as the Casablanca bloc because they had meetings between 1960 and 1962, and part of 1963. And one of their meetings was in Casablanca, Morocco. And these countries agreed with Nkrumah's idea of unification. So Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Algeria, Morocco, and Egypt. Algeria had been given assistance when the Algerians were fighting for independence. The provisional government of Algeria was given assistance by Ghana. This is Fanon and them. When Algeria gets independence in 1962, they're just like Ghana. They're committed to being a liberated territory to help other folks get free from colonization. So these are the Casablanca countries, the radical countries that are for this African unification, and they're anti-imperialists. On the other hand, and a much larger list, are the Monrovia bloc, and sometimes this is called the Brazzaville bloc. The French-speaking African countries, with the exception of Guinea and Mali, and Algeria, that had gotten their independence in the early 1960s, but agreed to be a part of that French African community. So they essentially agreed to be neo-colonies. They weren't for African unification. They were not actively helping the Algerians between 1960 and 1962 get independence, because you can't be a partner of France yet helping the Algerians get independence from France. So they might say in their statements, yeah, we're for the Algerian people, but they're not actually supporting the Algerian struggle because they're in bed with France. And then you got the countries like Nigeria and they're not on here, but Sierra Leone and Liberia, who weren't actively in bed with the English, not the same way as the French, but they were committed to maintaining national sovereignty. They didn't want to give up their national sovereignty to be a part of a United States of Africa. This is what Nigeria's position was. This is what Liberia's position was, that no, we want to stay independent countries. We don't want to be a part of a United States of Africa. And they had their reasons. Nigeria in particular, Nigeria's position was, we're trying to consolidate Nigeria. You know, we have a huge population, a diverse population. We need to work on Nigerian nationalism. Nigeria is going to have its own problems with Biafra in a few years. But that was their project. So they said, Ghana, you're going too fast. Before we can talk about the United States of Africa, let's unify Nigeria first. So these countries were against this idea. So you had these two blocs emerging in Africa by the time we get to 1963. But Nkrumah is still strong on this idea that we need to have something continental. We need to have some type of organization that we can all come together and at least, if we're not going to unite as a complete country, we at least need to have a forum where we can discuss our ideas on a continental basis. So all of these groups got together, and they got together in Ethiopia. Again, Ethiopia has always been that symbol of African freedom and African Renaissance. Really, it was the only country that wasn't colonized. We talked about that. So, in Ethiopia, in the capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, in 1963, the Organization of African Unity is founded, and it is a compromise organization between these two groups. And really, it's much more in line with what these folks wanted, which was a voluntary association that was focused on, economic cooperation. It was focused on soft diplomacy, and it was, at least in objective, focused on freeing Africa from colonization. That's what they said. Now, what that was actually going to mean in practice meant different things for different countries, but at least they wrote, we want Africa to be free from colonization. So it was a compromise organization. It wasn't what Nkrumah wanted, and the folks in the Monrovia group at least said, all right, well, we'll write down on paper that we support decolonization and liberation from colonial rule. So that's what the OAU was founded in 1963. And it made its headquarters Ethiopia. The headquarters to this day, and now it's called the African Union. It's in Ethiopia. So 1963, this happens. Across the Atlantic, 1963 is also an important year. It's the year of the March on Washington. It's the year that Malcolm X leaves the Nation of Islam. So a lot of important things are happening. So this is the first summit in 1963 where they agree what the organization is going to be, what its guidelines are, and then they plan to have their next meeting in Cairo, Egypt in 1964. This is just an image of Nkrumah and the head of state of Ethiopia at the time, Emperor Haile Selassie. Selassie and Nkrumah were kind of these dual figures in Africa, these huge figures in Africa. Ethiopia was definitely more on the side of the Monrovia group, but it kind of played a middle ground of recognizing the importance of Pan-African cooperation, but again, not ready to cede its sovereignty for the United States of Africa. By the end of the decade, or 10 years after this, about 1975, both of these men would be deposed. And we'll talk about that in a second. The meeting that happened the next year in 1964, Malcolm X attended. And this is the meeting that we're going to talk about. But I'm going to stop for a second and open it up to any questions, and then we'll talk about the next meeting of the OAU in 1964. So, Daniel, is there anything in the chat or any hands up that folks would like to ask?
2 questions in the chat and then a couple hands. Somebody asked, how was Clayton Powell able to get a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives as a black man from Harlem at that time?
So he had gone into Congress, and my dates might be wrong, but it might have been in the late 40s, early 50s. I got to double check that. But essentially, I mean, Harlem, New York didn't have the voting restrictions that you had in places like the South and other places. So you could get black elected officials in places like Chicago, parts of Pennsylvania, and New York, because you had the numbers. So he's representing Harlem. So black people are voting in Harlem. So they voted for a black representative. And then he was a reverend too. So he had a church. So he already had a base, and he was politically active. So the people knew Adam Clayton Powell, and he was able to be elected into Congress. And I got to double check the dates on that, but I think it was the late 40s or 50s. So yeah, that was definitely possible in New York. It's a good question.
And the only other thing I see in the chat, somebody was asking if it was possible to get a closer view of the slides.
I'll post the slides on the course website, but that's the best we could do from the way we show it here. And I see a couple of hands. So Daniel, go ahead and let me know, let folks know that they can ask the question.
Okay, Mr. Francis, go ahead, and then Mr. Thomas.
Well, thank you, everyone, and good morning. Another really well put together presentation at Dr. Liberated. You mentioned that Algeria gained independence from France in 1962. It was the same year that Jamaica and Trinidad got their independence from Great Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And 4 years later, British Guyana got its independence in 1966. Is there a connection between the movement for independence in Africa and in the Caribbean at the same time?
Definitely. All this stems from the end of World War II. Once that happened, and a lot of the rhetoric, I mean, African people had always been fighting for independence, but that great European tribal war became an opening. Once Europe was weak, they could advance those movements further in the 1950s and in the 1960s. And then they played off of particularly Britain's own rhetoric of freedom and the US's rhetoric of fundamental freedoms for people, because as they were struggling against Hitler, facing their own colonization, they used these terms. So then once the war was over, Black folks say, hey, well, if those are good enough ideas for you to get your freedom from Hitler, they're good enough ideas for us to get our freedom from you. And the British are slick. I mean, these guys know what they're doing. So they'll say, okay, we'll give you flag independence. I mean, we'll allow you to put your flag up and change the anthem and these types of things, but we're still going to be connected with you economically. So there'll be a limit to what you can do. Then you still have the Queen, you're still part of the Commonwealth. So it's kind of like a judo move. And for those of you that play judo or know that martial art, where you use your opponent's momentum to throw them. Like, you're not doing too much, you're just using technique. So the British are seeing this movement for independence coming, and instead of fighting against it, they just pivot and flip you over so you think that you're free, but they're really putting you in a position to still be economically dependent and those types of things. So yes, it's all connected, definitely.
And by the way, Guyana's independence was celebrated Thursday this week.
Oh, thank you for reminding me. One other thing about this. This past week, May 25th, is African Liberation Day. It actually celebrates the founding of the OAU. It's funny how things get changed because for many years, African Liberation Day, May 25th, was celebrated around the world as a revolutionary holiday. It was a day to think about for much of the 60s and 70s and 80s. It was a day to think about how we can actively support ongoing liberation movements in Africa. In the 70s, it was the Portuguese colonies and to end apartheid. In the 80s, it was to end apartheid. And even in the 90s, it was to end neocolonialism. And African Liberation Day still is celebrated as such. But like many celebrations, it has been co-opted by a number of people. And now it's become something called like Africa Day or African Freedom Day, which has taken out the revolutionary tenor of it in a lot of places and has become a softer version of what it was. This has happened with Emancipation Day. This has happened with, I can see it happening right now with Juneteenth. I've seen it happen with Martin Luther King Day, where these days that are supposed to represent, revolutionary feelings and social movements and days for folks to really have these discussions have just become days off. They have been accepted by imperialists themselves that will talk. I saw a couple of years ago, AFRICOM, the U.S. African Command, these collection of military bases throughout Africa that are controlled by the U.S. That interfere in African politics and development. They put up on their website, Happy African Freedom Day. As a neocolonial apparatus, as an aggressive military force in Africa, they put up Happy African Liberation Day. So you see how holidays can be co-opted to be something that they never were supposed to be. So African Liberation Day is important, something that we should always reclaim, and a number of groups are doing it the right way. The All African People's Revolutionary Party, which was founded by Kwame Nkrumah, and you guys may be more familiar with it through the work of Stokely Carmichael and Kwame Ture. who popularized African Liberation Day in the 1970s. There were big celebrations in DC, in Guinea-Bissau. There's some going on today, actually, all around the world. So that's an important thing to bring up. So I'm glad you mentioned that Independence Day, because that's key. I think I see another hand.
Mr. Thomas, go ahead.
Good morning, all. Once again, I have great concern, and I'd like to be told whether or not I should be. Because the West Indies countries got independence so easily, and now that we're moving away from the monarchy, and we're moving steadfast in republicanism, well, I don't believe that we're prepared enough. I don't believe that we're united enough to be able to withstand standing alone in that sense. Could you shed some light on that?
Yeah, I don't know if anyone's ever completely prepared for what independence means. I mean, you could try your best, but it's always better to be experimenting with independence than thinking that we're secure under somebody else's rule. I'll say it like that. So whatever will happen, we just have to hope and organize and advocate that it's done in the best interest of the people. But that's all we could do. But it's better to be figuring those things out independently than feeling comfortable under the monarchy or some other apparatus, external apparatus. That would be my opinion on that.
Oh. The idea is that in the past we talk about stitches and sellouts. And right about now, I don't know whether it is stitches or the sellouts, but whatever is going on in the West Indies now, particularly in Jamaica, there's no rhetoric really. It's abominable.
Yeah. It's something to be watched and something to be organized against. And the key thing is to watch the political parties and what they do and how they support the masses, how they interact with the masses. More importantly, what their positions are on land, what their positions are on relations with China and Chinese interests and American interests. Those are the things that are kind of the markers to show where people's interests really lie. So all of that is to be monitored. All right. We'll go a little bit more. We'll probably stop in about 20 minutes because I do have to go to another meeting, so I have to leave here very quickly, but we'll go to about 12:20. All right, so year later, Malcolm X is back in Africa. So Malcolm had first visited Africa actually in 1959 as a representative of the Nation of Islam. So he was in Africa. He had visited Egypt and Sudan in 1959. But he goes back to Africa in 1964. So he's broken from the Nation of Islam. He broke from the Nation of Islam basically at the beginning of 1964. It started at the end of 63. He goes to Africa in April of 1964 and also July 1964 for the summit in Cairo. And that is the Zanzibarian revolutionary Abdul Rahman Babu, who Malcolm was connected with. He was a revolutionary from what's now Tanzania. Before Tanganyika and Zanzibar united to become Tanzania, he was representing the revolutionaries in Zanzibar. So Malcolm is at the OAU summit in Cairo. And I just want to play you a quick video of Malcolm X talking about Africa. So we'll watch a few minutes of this and then we'll finish up. So Daniel, if you wouldn't mind sharing that video, and we'll watch some of this. And while this is being set up, let me say this before you hit play. His relationship with Africa was influenced by not only his travels and his parents' Garvey experience, but also by the tutelage he received from Queen Mother Audley Moore and her sister Eloise Moore. These were Black women activists who were in the Garvey movement, who were also in Black nationalist circles in Harlem. So you should know about Queen Mother Moore. Look her up. Queen Mother Audley Moore and her sister Eloise Moore, as well as who Daniel talked about last week, Carlos Cooks, who gave Malcolm a lot of information about Africa. So, okay, Daniel, go ahead and play that. If you can make it full screen, please do. And make sure your sound, there it is.
And this is the condition that our people in the West are in today. The struggle in the States between the races has always been bloody, but it has been one-sided. The Negro has been doing most of the bleeding. But I believe he's beginning to feel that bleeding should be reciprocal. It should be done equally on both sides. Everybody should bleed. If the Negro is going to bleed, everybody should bleed. And I think he's beginning to see this thing. It should be equalized.
The struggle of the colored peoples of the world against the forces of Western imperialism and invasion has been going on for a long time. On the continents of North and South America, in Asia, in Africa, oppressed peoples have been waging a tireless campaign against domination at the hands of imperialists and their insane doctrine of racial supremacy. But at the very moment when the last outpost of colonialist barbarians seemed most comfortable, at the very moment when representatives of the self-styled master race feeling most secure and certain of continuing their vicious schemes of enslavement, our people are affirming their humanity. We are demanding an end to centuries of exploitation. We are proving that imperialism, far from being invincible, is now on its last leg. Indeed, throughout the world, the colored peoples are mobilizing and uniting their ranks to intensify and to speed up the certain death of colonialism and neo-colonialism. We are preparing ourselves for the final showdown with the well-known enemies of human rights and human dignity. Intimidation through fear and the reign of the Ku Klux Klan is facing destruction. And what is the actual situation in the United States, where over 20 million colored people virtually live as a colonized nation under racist and economic oppression?
Well, for the past 10 years, the struggle in America has been confined to what has been projected to the public as a civil rights struggle. And in that context, it has remained a domestic problem. It has remained within the jurisdiction of the United States. And as such, it has been impossible for the Afro-Americans or American Negroes to try and enlist support of other dark-skinned people who are being oppressed the world over in that struggle. And the difference now in the direction that the struggle is taking, from the direction that the struggle has been going in the past, there are many of our people who are thinking more deeply, more broadly, and are beginning to see the importance of lifting it out of the national context, or out of the domestic context, or beyond the jurisdiction of the United States government. And the only way this can be done is by internationalizing the problem and putting it at a level where it can be taken into the United Nations. And then all of the other independent nations on this earth can involve themselves in our struggle and support us. And the only way by which this can be done, instead of it being called civil rights in the future, we're going to have to label it a human rights struggle, a struggle for human rights. And as such, we can then take it into the United Nations through the avenues that have been set up by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. We can take our problem for the United Nations same manner that the problem of South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Hungary, the Arab refugee problem, it becomes a world problem. And as a world problem, then the Afro-American or so-called Negroes have more of a chance of getting some real meaningful results because it's not left up to the one who's responsible for it anymore. It's put at a level where the whole world can see that our plight is wrong, and they can bring the moral support of the entire world on our side against this force that is in our past and the past. It also makes a difference in the leadership. Those who have been posing as leaders of our people in America in the past, most of they can pose on this local stage where Uncle Sam is the master of the show and can prop them up and make them look good, make them look better than they actually are by giving them token gains and building them up an image. But when they come onto the international stage or the world stage, then Uncle Sam can't prop them up anymore. And their ability or lack of ability becomes exposed. And if they can lead us forward, they remain leaders. But if they can't, then they have to step aside and more qualified and bona fide leaders step up from the masses of our people, and then we get more, we get faster progress, we get more results.
Malcolm X came from the masses as the genuine leader of his people. He was well aware of the forced division planted between them, for he himself had overcome many of these artificial barriers to emerge as a voice which raised our strongest demands for freedom and justice in America. This man combined his recognition of the chief ethnic of the African and Afro-American people with an objective knowledge of where our strength lay. He talks about the black intellectual, he talks about education, revolutionary education, he talks about the task of our women.
Well, in the past, the Afro-American or American Negro intellectual perhaps permitted himself to be used in a way that wasn't really beneficial to the overall Afro-American struggle. But I think today these intellectuals have begun to undertake a new appraisal of the problem, looking at it as it actually is, and are beginning to see it more in the international with the African struggle. And the African intellectual is beginning to look at the problem in the African context and see that what might be good in one country, in order for it to be used in another country, has to be rearranged. You take African socialism. Many of the African intellectuals that have analyzed the approach of socialism are beginning to see where the African has to use a form of socialism that fits into the African context, whereas the form that is used in a European country might be good for that particular European country. It doesn't fit as well into the African context. So I think the African intellectual is making that contribution and making it well. One thing that I became aware of as I traveled recently to Africa and the Middle East, in every country that you go to, usually the degree of progress can never be separated from the woman. If you're in a country that's progressive, the woman is progressive. If you're in a country that reflects the consciousness for the importance of education, it's because the woman is aware of the importance of education. But in every backward country, you'll find the women are backward. And in every country where education is not stressed, it's because the women don't have education. So one of the things I became thoroughly convinced of in my recent travels is the importance of giving freedom to the woman, giving her education, and giving her the incentive to get out there and put that same spirit and understanding into children. And I frankly am proud of the contribution that our women have made in the struggle for freedom. And I'm one person who's giving them all of the leeway possible because they've made a greater contribution than many of us men. And one of the best ways that they can help is to encourage the man, try and inspire him to be more militant and turn him away from being non-violent, passive, and meek and humble tarnish, make him aware that the black woman wants to see her man be a man instead of around here using religion as an excuse to be a coward and some of the things that he's been reflecting here lately.
Freedom by any means necessary was the best slogan of Malcolm X, for he knew that in America, the condition of the vast majority of the 22 million black people is very close to the condition of 11 million Africans on the also knew of the resources of the people of African ancestry outside of Africa. Time and time again, he called them our oppressed brothers everywhere to fight against the type of slavery which the United States imposed on all of us.
Most people, when we say Afro-American, they think only of the Negroes in the United States, but they don't realize that 2/3 of Brazil consists of people of African blood, which means they're also Afro-American because Brazil is in South America. And in all of these, many of these countries in South America, in Central America, and even in Canada, they are heavily populated with people whose ancestors came from Africa. So when you total up the number of Afro-Americans, real Afro-Americans, in the Western Hemisphere, there are perhaps 100 million. And if these people ever unite among themselves, not only is it necessary for the Afro-Americans in the United States to be organized, but it's also necessary for the Afro-Americans in the Caribbean, and the Afro-Cubans, the Afro-Brazilians. It's necessary for all of them to be organized. And then once they're organized in each place, we have to organize among ourselves so that the Afro-American in the United States will be working in conjunction in a coordinated program with those who are in Cuba, and those in Brazil, and those in Venezuela, and those throughout the Caribbean, and Haiti, and in the West Indian Islands. And in this way, we actually get strength. And it's not an accident that there's no organization existing in the Western Hemisphere that's designed toward that end. It would be a direct threat to imperialism as it really exists, and colonialism as it exists in the West. And one of the things that's going to help to bring this about is the independence of Africa. One of the only reasons that we in the West have never organized, we have hated our image and our African image. And because Africa has been in the hands of people who have created an image of Africa that's negative and hateful. And it has been hateful to us. We haven't wanted to identify with it. But now that Africa is getting independent and in a position to create its own image, and it's a positive image, those of us in the West look at the African image and see how positive it is. We begin to identify with it. We become proud of Africa, and we become proud of our African blood, our African heritage. And this is what is beginning to make the Africans in the Western Hemisphere today have developed more race pride. And as this race pride develops, then it has a tendency to make us want to unite together and work together. And your Western imperialists, colonialists, consider this to be a grave threat. More threat than communism or Marxism or socialism or anything else. The Africanism is what they consider to be the real threat.
Yes.
All right, stop it there, Daniel. Thank you.
Senator Malcolm X's revolutionary strategy is solidarity.
All right, so that was Malcolm in 1964. Now, Malcolm would be assassinated in February 1965. So you're seeing where he was at the end of his life. And he's putting all this in place. And his visit to the summit wasn't just as an observer. He went to the summit of the OAU and he passed around a resolution that he was able, through his connections with the heads of state that he knew, able to get this resolution passed in the OAU, where the countries that were there, the states that were there, agreed that they would support a resolution calling on the U.S. to end racial discrimination against Black folks. It was part of a number of resolutions passed at this summit, another one including a resolution against apartheid in South Africa. So Malcolm was able to get the diplomatic support of the independent African countries. Now, they couldn't be as forceful as he in their resolution, because again, many of them still had connections with the U.S., but it was a start. It was something that Malcolm could bring back to the U.S. to say, hey, the heads of state of Africa all got together and they said, we are committed to helping Black folks fight against racial discrimination in the United States. Malcolm also took from the OAU this idea of the organization of Afro-American unities. Right? What he just talked about in that video, this is what his organization was going to do. It was going to bring together all of the Black organizations in the Americas. It was not just about the United States, but Canada, Brazil, Cuba, Jamaica, all these places. It was going to be very much like Garvey's organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. But the Organization of Afro-American Unity, he started with the U.S., and he said this. He says, I want to bring together, I saw in Africa what Nkrumah was able to do. He was able to bring together even those countries that weren't necessarily for a United States of Africa, but they still formed the OAU. They still formed an organization where some of them were capitalists, some of them were socialists, some of them were this, that, and the third, but at least they had an organization where they could come, talk about their differences, and at least come to some common agreements on some things. So he said, we need that in the US and in the Americas as a whole. So he sent out messages to all the other civil rights organizations that he had bashed in the past. He sent messages to Dr. King, messages to the NAACP, to the Urban League, to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, to all these groups. And he said, look, let's form this. Yeah, we have differences, but there are some things that we are in agreement about, and we can talk about, we can build off these things. He wanted to bring everybody together, and he started this organization, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, based off of the Organization of African Unity. So he just took these ideas and brought them back. This is what he was organizing. And the whole idea, again, he mentioned in the video, as these African countries got independence, that's more and more countries that are going to have voices in the United Nations, at least in the General Assembly and on the Commission for Human Rights. So he's saying the new strategy is, as these countries get independence, and they already signed a resolution saying that they were going to support Africans fighting against racial discrimination in the US, they can be the voice, the diplomatic voice for African Americans on the international stage to say, hey, US, you are violating the human rights of our African brothers and sisters, and we're going to bring this up in the UN. Now, Malcolm, I think, overestimated the power of the UN, seeing as though the US pays for the UN, pays the bill for a lot of the bill for the UN, but it still was dangerous to the US because this is during the time of the Cold War. One of the reasons why the civil rights movement advanced as much as it did in the 1960s was because of the presence of the Soviet Union. As the US and the Soviet Union were competing with each other over dominance in the world, one of the ways that they did so was through propaganda. So the US would always point to the Soviet Union and say, look, you're mistreating Jews in the Soviet Union. You are committing, Stalin is committing mass murders. You're doing this, that, and the third. Your communism doesn't work, all of this. And then the Soviet Union would point back and say, well, you are putting fire hoses on little kids in Birmingham. You are not letting black people vote. So it was a propaganda war. So the US had to fix, they had to go, the federal government had to go to the South and say, hey, you're making us look bad on the international stage, and we're losing support in this Cold War against the Soviet Union. So we need to pass this Civil Rights Act and this Voting Rights Act in 1965 because we're losing ground, diplomatic ground internationally. Malcolm understood this. So by putting the US up on human rights violations in the UN was a very strategic move and very dangerous move. And this is why many people think these are one of the reasons that facilitated Malcolm's assassination in 1965, the stuff that he's talking about. When Malcolm was in the nation saying the white man was the devil and arguing for black separatism and these types of things, he was dangerous. But he wasn't as dangerous as when he left the Nation of Islam and young white people started listening to him. And he became a more international figure. He's meeting with heads of state, of nations, representing Afro-America. He's assassinated a few months after the founding of this organization. The same thing is going to happen to Dr. King in 1967, when King makes his statement against Vietnam and becomes more internationalist in his outlook and more radical. This is when King is assassinated. He makes a speech against the U.S. presence in Vietnam, April 4th, 1967. Dr. King is assassinated April 4th, 1968, a year to the day after he makes that speech. So we see how dangerous black leaders thinking internationally becomes. Nkrumah would write in a book that he wrote in 1968 called The Specter of Black Power. Even though I don't agree with King on some of his nonviolent views, I mourn for him. So he writes this after King was assassinated. He said, the final solution of all this will come when Africa is politically united. This is what Malcolm believed as well. Yesterday was Malcolm X, today Martin Luther King, tomorrow fire all over the United States. And Nkrumah was reflecting on what had happened in the United States in 1968. And Nkrumah also had his own problems with the United States, because again, the US is an imperial power. So not only are they quelling these ideas or attempting to quell these ideas inside the United States, but Nkrumah was the #1 enemy of the United States in Africa. So after Lumumba is assassinated, now things are being put in place to remove Nkrumah from power, because he starts really analyzing and writing much more about the role of the U.S. in imperialism, the U.S. and its allies in imperialism. So he writes Africa Unite in 1963. We talk about Africa must unite. He writes this philosophical text called Conscientism in 1964. And then in 1965, he writes one of his great works, Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, where he's reflecting on the Congo Crisis. He's reflecting on other things he's seeing in Africa, and he's realizing that although colonialism is ending, we're entering a new phase called neocolonialism. And he breaks down all the aspects of what that looks like, because it's a much more harder beast to fight than colonialism. Because of this, and because of all the other things he was doing, using Ghana as a liberated zone and promoting this idea of a United States of Africa, the British, the Americans, and then forces inside of Ghana that were, they didn't have, everybody in Ghana didn't have the vision that Nkrumah had. Some folks in Ghana had the same vision that the Monrovia group folks had, that Ghana should be worried about its own sovereignty. Ghana should be worried about its own economic development. And what Nkrumah is doing is jeopardizing Ghana's future by connecting with all these Pan-African projects and all this stuff. Nkrumah also had run afoul of many of the traditional chiefs in Ghana, because Nkrumah Nkrumah looked at the chiefs as puppets of the West, many of them, because during the time of colonization, they weren't that vocal against the British. The ones that were vocal against the British, people like Yaya Santiwa and others, were exiled or killed, and the ones that remained were pretty much in league with the British. So once independence came, Nkrumah had this kind of, arm's length relationship with the traditional leaders in Ghana. So they never were a fan of Nkrumah, and you had other folks in Ghana that saw Nkrumah as a threat. So in 1966, when Nkrumah was away in China trying to negotiate actually a peace agreement for the Vietnam crisis, his military overthrew him. Officers in the military that were trained by the British and by the Americans, and it was called Operation Cold Chop by the CIA. It was an operation that they took these military officers, they say, we want you to be in charge of Ghana now, so here's what you're gonna do. When Nkrumah's gone, you're gonna take over the reins of government. So Nkrumah is overthrown, and this National Liberation Council is set up. And many of these military officers had received schooling at various British officer training institutions. So it's not a surprise that they did what they did. And then they were committed to maintaining relationships with the US and with Western Europe. And these were the folks that ran Ghana for years after Nkrumah's overthrow. But that wasn't the end of the story for Nkrumah. Nkrumah gets overthrown, and instead of just giving up, he goes to Guinea. And in fact, he's named the co-president of Guinea by Sékou Touré. In fact, the funny story is Nkrumah didn't speak French. So remember what Nkrumah and Ghana did for Guinea when France tried to destabilize Guinea at independence. Well, when Nkrumah goes to Guinea, there's a big, he's there, he's being introduced to the big stadium. And the story goes that Sékou Touré is saying something in French, and he's speaking, he's getting the people all riled up. And then when he comes back from the podium, Nkrumah asks Sékou Touré what he said. Sékou Touré says, well, I just made you president of Guinea. And Nkrumah was like, no, I can't be president of Guinea. We can be co-presidents. You handle the internal, and Nkrumah was responsible for handling the external foreign relations and continuing his Pan-African project in Guinea. So you have this co-presidency in Guinea. It's one of the few times in history that you have something like this. So he's co-president of Guinea, and he continues to analyze the African civil situation. He connects with the Black Power advocates. Now, as Malcolm was a child of Garvey, after Malcolm's assassination, you see a new generation of activists, both in the Caribbean and in the US, that are children of Malcolm. These are people that listen to Malcolm. He becomes a martyr for them. And one of the key figures of that is Stokely Carmichael, who's going to change his name to Kwame Ture. But he goes to Guinea and he studies with Kwame Nkrumah. And Nkrumah would work and advocate and write on African liberation until his death, actually in 1972. He dies of cancer. I think it's cancer in 1972. And there's even some suspicion around that as well. But anyway, before he passes, he writes two key books. Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, where he reflects on what happened to him in Ghana in 1966, and Class Struggle in Africa. In Handbook, I'll just read this quickly because we'll close up. It said, this book has been written during my stay in Conakry. Notes made for a manual of guerrilla warfare for African freedom fighters was left behind in Ghana in 1966. He said, the Black Power movement in the US and the struggles of peoples of African descent in the Caribbean, South America, and elsewhere form an integral part of the African political, military, revolutionary struggle. Our victory will be their victory also, and the victory of all the revolutionary, oppressed, and exploited masses of the world who are challenging the capitalist, imperialist, and neocolonialist power structure of reaction and counter-revolution. He also writes in Class Struggle in Africa, the core of the Black revolution is Africa. And until Africa is united under a socialist government, the Black man throughout the world lacks a national home. This book, Class Struggle in Africa, is actually going to take us to right where we need to be for next week, because we're going to be talking about the 1970s and continued revolutions in Africa. So this is all building, these are all the building blocks of the African Renaissance, and revolution is a key part of that. But part of that revolution, if you don't mind sharing this last thing, he writes about class divisions in Africa. And he says, Africa has in fact, in its midst, a core bourgeoisie who are analogous to colonists and settlers in that they live in positions of privilege, a small, selfish, money-minded, reactionary minority among vast masses of exploited and oppressed people. And he's talking about other Africans at this point, other Black people. Although apparently strong because of their support from neocolonialists and imperialists, they are extremely vulnerable. Their survival depends on foreign support. Once this vital link is broken, they become powerless to maintain their positions and privileges. They, in the hidden hand of neocolonialism and imperialism, which supports and abets reaction and exploitation, now tremble before the rising tide of worker and peasant awareness of the class struggle in Africa. And Nkrumah writes this because he's realizing that as these countries get independence, and thanks for that, as these countries get independence, the new struggle is not just against the old colonizer, but also against their supporters in Africa, this privileged class of African elite that make their living off the exploitation of the masses. And in the 1970s, this is most striking in what we're going to talk about next week, which is the Ethiopian Revolution, 1974, 1975, where the class struggle in Africa really explodes. So we'll stop there for today, and we got about 5 minutes for a question and answer. We can't go into our open discussion as much as we normally do because I have a mentorship meeting that I need to run to. So Daniel, do we have any questions in the chat?
Yes. Somebody said this may have already been answered, but I'm wondering how aware Africans were of what was happening to Black Americans. In his book, he mentions them not being aware of it.
Somewhat. I mean, a good amount. A lot of the leaders were, because we talked about this before. Many of the leaders were educated in America. People like Nnamdi Azikiwe, Kwame Nkrumah, others, and then particularly traveling to the U.S. for UN meetings and in D.C. So there was a lot of awareness and a lot of exchange. That goes all the way back even into the Garvey movement. So people traveling, people exchanging information, a lot of that was known. And then it made international news. Whatever happens in the US made international news. So the bombings in Birmingham, the water being put on kids, all that stuff was broadcast internationally. So yeah, people knew.
Another question says, it seems that some of the chiefs who didn't oppose the British were fearful for their lives. What was happening to traditional spirituality at this time? Was the same spirituality and oath-taking used in slave revolts no longer as popular, or did they not feel the same sense of urgency?
A lot of things, I mean, after the initial defeats, in the early 1900s, like Ya Santiwa's rebellion, and when, particularly when Prempeh, the Asante Hene goes into exile, you don't see a whole lot of large-scale rebellions up until independence is granted, because the new leadership that comes in kind of makes agreements with the British. So it quells a lot of that, and the kind of masses kind of followed that. Now, in terms of the religion, that's a good question, because you see Christianity become more and more prominent, but those traditions never completely go away. But Christianity does become much more prominent among the leadership. I guess I'm assuming we're talking about Ghana, in between those years of colonial consolidation and independence. So it doesn't completely go away, but it's not as strong as it was, of course, before. Yeah.
That was the last question in the chat. I can't tell if Mr. Thomas has a new question or if that's up from before.
I was up from before. Sorry about that.
Okay. All right, then. If there's no questions or comments, again, I apologize. We don't have time for open discussion today, but we will next week. So join us next week. We'll pick up in 1975. We'll probably go from 1975 to 1980. We'll talk about revolutions. We will talk about, the revolutions in Africa. And so we'll stop there for the day. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. The recording will be available. Please go to the course website, do the readings, check out the information, and we will meet again next week.